January 6, 2022, Beverly Hills, California. Sidney Poitier's home glowed in the morning light. Sunlight spilled across the marble floors like a curtain lifting for one final scene. The scent of lilies hung thick in the air, graceful and unbearable all at once. Outside, the city waited, quiet, reverent, unaware that its brightest light was dimming. Sidney Poitier was dying. The man who had broken barriers, who had carried the weight of an entire race on his shoulders, who had shown the world that dignity could not be taken, only given, lay in his bed, surrounded by family, his body finally surrendering after 94 years of standing tall. He had taught the world dignity. Now he was teaching it silence. The official cause of death would be listed as natural causes. He was 94. He had lived a full life, achieved everything, left behind a legacy that would endure for generations. But for a man who once wrote, "It's lonely being a symbol. Everyone loves the idea of you, but not you." Could his death really be separated from the decades of isolation, pressure, and the impossible burden of perfection that had defined his existence? In his final years, Sidney had retreated from the public eye, living quietly, writing, reflecting. He had given instructions. No grand funeral, no state memorial, no spectacle. He wanted to leave as he had lived, with dignity, with grace, with as little fuss as possible. Even in death, Sidney Poitier was thinking about what his life meant to others. Even in death, he was performing. Sidney Poitier had been called the first black man to win the Academy Award for Best Actor, the first black movie star accepted by mainstream white audiences, the first to prove that a black man could carry a Hollywood film without compromise. But to be the first, as he often said, is not to be free. It is to be watched, scrutinized, judged by a standard no one else has to meet. Sidney spent his entire life walking a tightrope, too dignified for some, not angry enough for others, a symbol of hope to millions and a reminder of compromise to just as many. He once said, "I am not a symbol. I am a man." But the world had decided otherwise, and the burden of being both a man and a symbol slowly crushed him in ways that no Oscar, no accolade, no standing ovation could ever heal. What does it cost to be perfect? What kind of loneliness comes from never being allowed to fail? Was Sidney Poitier a hero who changed history, or a man who sacrificed his own humanity to prove that black people deserved to be treated as human? To understand how it all ended in that quiet room in Beverly Hills, we must first understand how it began on a small island in the Bahamas, where a boy named Sidney was born 2 months premature and not expected to survive. The first miracle in a life that would be defined by defying expectations. Sidney L. Poitier was born on February 20th, 1927 in Miami, Florida, but only by accident. His parents, Reginald and Evelyn Poitier, were tomato farmers from Cat Island in the Bahamas. They had traveled to Miami to sell their crops when Evelyn went into labor, 2 months early in a foreign country with no money and no plan. Sidney was born so small, so fragile, that the doctor who delivered him said he wouldn't survive the night. But he did. His parents took it as a sign, a miracle, proof that this child was meant for something greater. They had no idea how prophetic that would turn out to be, or how heavy that destiny would become. Sidney grew up on Cat Island, a place of stunning beauty and crushing poverty. His family lived in a small house with no electricity, no running water, and barely enough food. But what they lacked in material wealth, they made up for in dignity. Sidney's father was a stern, principled man who believed that poverty was no excuse for poor character. He taught Sidney that respect was earned through conduct, that dignity was not a gift but a decision you made every morning. "You walk with your head up," his father told him, "always, no matter what." It was a lesson Sidney would carry for the rest of his life, and one that would both elevate and imprison him. As a child, Sidney was curious, restless, drawn to stories and dreams that seemed impossible for a boy from Cat Island. He would listen to travelers' tales about America, about cities with lights that never went out, about opportunities that didn't exist in the Bahamas. When he was 15, his parents sent him to Miami to live with his brother, hoping he would find work and send money back home. But Miami in 1943 was a city of brutal racial segregation. Sidney, who had grown up in the Bahamas where black people were the majority, was unprepared for the violence of American racism. He was beaten by police for walking in the wrong neighborhood. He was refused service at restaurants. He was called words he had never heard before, words designed to strip him of his humanity. Was this the moment that shaped him? The realization that in America, a black man's dignity had to be fought for every single day? Sidney couldn't survive in Miami. The racism was too overt, too violent, too suffocating. At 16, he left for New York City, arriving with nothing but a few dollars and a suitcase. He slept in bus stations, washed dishes for pennies, and struggled to understand a world that seemed determined to keep him at the bottom. But Sidney refused to accept that fate. He had been raised to believe that dignity was non-negotiable, and if America wouldn't give him dignity, he would take it. He would force the world to see him not as a stereotype, not as a threat, but as a man. But how do you do that when the very system is designed to make you invisible? One day, Sidney saw a notice in a newspaper. The American Negro Theater was holding auditions. He showed up, eager, hopeful, ready to prove himself. But when he opened his mouth to read the script, the director stopped him. "Your accent is too thick," the director said. "You can't even read properly. We can't use you." Sidney was devastated. He had been rejected, not for lack of talent, but for something as arbitrary as the way he spoke. But instead of giving up, Sidney made a decision. He would teach himself to speak like an American. He bought a radio and listened to it every night, repeating words, mimicking accents, erasing every trace of his Bahamian identity. It took months. But eventually he returned to the theater, auditioned again, and this time he was accepted. Was this transformation an act of self-improvement? Or the first erasure of who Sidney Poitier really was? Sidney's early years in theater were grueling. He worked menial jobs during the day and rehearsed at night. He was talented, disciplined, hungry for success. But he was also navigating a world that had very specific ideas about what a black actor could be. Most roles available to black men were servants, criminals, clowns, degrading stereotypes designed to reinforce white supremacy. Sidney refused them. He turned down role after role, even when he was broke, even when he didn't know where his next meal would come from. "I knew that if I failed, it would take my whole race down with me," he later said. But that knowledge was also a prison. He couldn't just be an actor trying to make it in Hollywood. He had to be a representative, a symbol, a martyr for a cause larger than himself. The weight of that responsibility manifested in ways both visible and invisible. Sidney developed a reputation for being impossibly punctual, impeccably dressed, unfailingly polite. He never raised his voice, never lost his temper, never gave anyone a reason to dismiss him as anything other than professional. His colleagues marveled at his self-control. But what they saw as discipline was actually survival. Sidney understood that white America was looking for any excuse to prove that black people didn't belong in their spaces. One outburst, one moment of weakness, one display of human imperfection, and it wouldn't just be Sidney who suffered. It would be every black actor who came after him. Every black person trying to prove their worth in a system designed to keep them out. The burden was crushing, and it was invisible, because to acknowledge the burden would be to admit vulnerability, and vulnerability was a luxury Sidney could not afford. There were moments when the mask slipped, though Sidney tried to hide them. One night, after a particularly brutal audition where he was told he was too dignified for a role, Sidney sat alone in his apartment and wept. He wrote in his journal, "They want me to be less than I am. They want me to shrink. But if I shrink, what am I proving? That they were right all along." It was an impossible contradiction. He couldn't play stereotypes because it would degrade his race. But he couldn't play fully human, complex characters because Hollywood wasn't ready to see black men as fully human. He was trapped between two equally untenable positions, and the only way through was to create a third option. To be so perfect, so dignified, so undeniably excellent that he could not be dismissed. It was exhausting. It was unsustainable. But it was the only path he could see. Could anyone bear that weight and still remain whole? His breakthrough came in 1950 when he was cast in No Way Out, a film about racial tensions in a hospital. Sidney played a doctor, a groundbreaking role for a black actor at the time. Critics noticed him. Hollywood noticed him. But more importantly, black audiences noticed him. Here was a black man on screen who was intelligent, educated, dignified, not a caricature, not a servant, but a human being. Sidney became a symbol of possibility, but symbols don't get to make mistakes. Symbols don't get to be flawed, and Sidney understood that every role he took, every word he spoke, every gesture he made was being scrutinized not just as art, but as evidence that black people deserved equality. Was the Oscar nomination a validation, or just another reminder that he would never be seen for who he truly was? By the early 1960s, Sidney Poitier had become one of the most respected actors in Hollywood. He had starred in groundbreaking films like The Defiant Ones, A Raisin in the Sun, and Lilies of the Field. He had proven that a black man could carry a film that audiences, white audiences, would pay to see a black protagonist. And then, in 1964, something unprecedented happened. Sidney Poitier won the Academy Award for Best Actor for his role in Lilies of the Field, becoming the first black man ever to receive the honor. The room erupted in applause. He walked to the stage, accepted the award, gave a gracious speech. It should have been a moment of pure triumph. But it wasn't. That night, after the ceremony, Sidney didn't go to the after-parties. He didn't celebrate. He walked alone down Sunset Boulevard, the Oscar in his hand, and felt nothing but an overwhelming sense of loneliness. He later wrote in his diary, "I don't feel freer. I just feel more watched." The award, instead of liberating him, had intensified the pressure. The applause was thunderous, but all he heard was the sound of expectation. Now he wasn't just a successful actor, he was a symbol of progress, a proof of concept, a living argument against racism. And that meant he could never fail. He could never be mediocre. He could never be human. Behind all that glory, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? The mid-1960s were Sidney's peak and his breaking point. In 1967 alone, he starred in 3 landmark films: To Sir with Love in the Heat of the Night and Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Each film dealt directly with race. Each positioned Sidney as the moral center, the dignified black man who would educate, challenge, and ultimately redeem white characters. Audiences loved them. Critics praised them. Sidney became the highest-paid actor in Hollywood. But behind the scenes, he was suffocating. Every role was the same. The noble Negro, the perfectly controlled black man who never lost his temper, never showed weakness, never made white people uncomfortable. Sidney wanted to play complex characters, flawed human beings, but Hollywood only wanted him to play symbols. And America only wanted him to be a saint. What most people didn't understand was the toll this took on Sidney's psyche. He began to feel like he was disappearing into the roles, that the real Sidney Poitier, whoever that was being erased by the perpetual performance of dignity. In private, he struggled with insomnia, anxiety, a gnawing sense that he was living a lie. He would look in the mirror and wonder which face was real. The composed, eloquent man the world saw, or the frightened boy from Cat Island who still didn't understand how he had ended up here, carrying the hopes of millions. His co-stars noticed the strain. Katharine Hepburn, who worked with him on Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, later recalled, "Sidney was always on. Even during breaks, even in casual conversation, he maintained this incredible poise. I once asked him if he ever just let himself be messy, be human. He looked at me like I'd asked him to commit treason." Spencer Tracy, in one of his final interviews before his death, said something that haunted Sidney for years. "That boy carries the weight of the world, and nobody's asking if it's too heavy." But the most cutting observation came from someone who knew Sidney intimately, his then-wife, Juanita Hardy. In an interview decades later, she described their marriage during this period. Sidney was two people. There was the public Sidney who was perfect, who never made mistakes, who represented everything good and noble. And then there was the private Sidney who was so tired, so lonely, so desperate to just be himself. But even at home, he couldn't fully let go. He'd trained himself so thoroughly to be on that he didn't know how to turn it off. "I loved him, but I could never reach him. It was like loving a statue, beautiful, admirable, but ultimately untouchable." The backlash came from an unexpected place. As the civil rights movement gave way to the Black Power movement in the late 1960s, younger black activists began to criticize Sidney. They called him an Uncle Tom, a sellout, too accommodating to white audiences. They said his characters were too perfect, too unthreatening, that he was reinforcing the idea that black people had to be twice as good to be seen as equal. The criticism devastated Sidney. "I spent my whole life trying to elevate our image," he said, "and now I'm being called a traitor." He felt caught between two worlds. Too radical for white conservatives, too safe for black revolutionaries. He had tried to be a bridge, but bridges get walked on from both sides. The pain of this rejection ran deeper than professional disappointment. Sidney had genuinely believed that his strategy, proving black excellence through undeniable dignity, was the path forward. He had sacrificed so much for that belief, his privacy, his freedom to be flawed, his ability to take risks as an artist. And now he was being told that his sacrifice had been for nothing, that he had actually harmed the cause he was trying to serve. The existential crisis this provoked was profound. If the perfection he had cultivated was actually a problem, then who was he? What had his life meant? Had he wasted decades performing a role that ultimately served the oppressor? In 1968, at the height of his fame and the depth of his despair, something happened that crystallized Sidney's internal conflict. He was invited to speak at a rally for Martin Luther King Jr. shortly after King's assassination. Sidney stood before thousands of grieving, angry people, and for the first time in his career, he spoke without a script, without preparation, without the careful polish he usually brought to public appearances. He talked about his own doubts, his own fears, his own struggle to understand what it meant to be a black man in America. He admitted that he didn't have all the answers, that he was tired, that sometimes he wondered if dignity was enough. The crowd was silent, and then, slowly, they began to applaud. Not the thunderous performative applause he was used to, but something quieter, more genuine. In that moment, Sidney realized something. People didn't need him to be perfect. They needed him to be human. But by the time he understood that, it was too late. The persona had calcified. The symbol had eclipsed the man. And Sidney didn't know how to go back. Did this tragic event mark his downfall? Or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems? Sidney's response to the criticism was silence. He didn't defend himself publicly. He didn't lash out. He simply withdrew. For nearly a decade, Sidney stepped back from acting, focusing instead on directing and producing. He moved to the Bahamas, away from Hollywood, away from the spotlight, away from the constant scrutiny. He tried to be just Sidney, not a symbol, not an icon, just a man. When you spend a lifetime being watched, solitude starts to feel like mercy. But even in retreat, he couldn't escape. His absence was interpreted as a statement. People asked, where is Sidney Poitier? Why isn't he fighting? Why isn't he leading? The pressure never stopped. The expectations never ended. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? In those quiet years away from Hollywood, Sidney struggled with questions he had never allowed himself to ask before. He wrote in his journal late at night, trying to understand what his life had meant. "There are nights," he wrote, "when I wish I could be flawed just once without disappointing a generation." He felt trapped in a persona he had created, or that had been created for him. He couldn't be angry without being labeled a threat. He couldn't be vulnerable without being seen as weak. He couldn't be complicated without being criticized. The price of being the first was that he had to be perfect. And perfection, he realized, was another word for erasure. He asked only for sunlight and silence, the two things he had never owned. His personal life was equally complicated. Sidney had been married twice, had 6 daughters, but his relationships were strained. He had an affair with actress Diane Carroll while still married, a scandal that haunted him with guilt for decades. Carroll later said Sidney couldn't allow himself to be happy. He was always thinking about what people would say, what it would mean for his image, what message it would send. He loved me, but he loved the idea of himself more. Was that fair? Or was it the inevitable result of living a life where every personal choice was politicized, where even love had to be justified, where happiness was a luxury he couldn't afford? The relationship with Diane Carroll revealed the impossible contradictions of Sidney's life in ways that nothing else had. They met on the set of Porgy and Bess in 1959, and the connection was instant, electric, undeniable. For Sidney, who had spent years carefully controlling every aspect of his public persona, the intensity of his feelings for Diane was terrifying. She represented everything he had denied himself in pursuit of perfection: spontaneity, passion, vulnerability. With her, he could laugh without calculation, argue without fear of consequences, be imperfect without feeling like he was betraying his race. But the affair also represented everything that could destroy him. He was married with children. She was married to another man. And both of them were high-profile black entertainers at a time when the black community was desperately seeking moral leadership. If their relationship became public, it wouldn't just be seen as an affair. It would be seen as proof that black people couldn't maintain stable families, that they were morally inferior, that all the stereotypes were true. Sidney felt the weight of that perception crushing him. The affair lasted 9 years, conducted in secret, marked by stolen moments and constant anxiety. Diane later wrote in her memoir that Sidney would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, paralyzed by guilt and fear. He would say, "What are we doing? I'm destroying everything I've built. I'm proving them right about us." She tried to reassure him that they deserved happiness, that they were human beings entitled to make mistakes, to follow their hearts. But Sidney couldn't accept that. To him, his life wasn't his own. It belonged to every black person who was counting on him to be better, to be stronger, to be the proof that they deserved equality. Eventually, the relationship ended. Not because the love died, but because Sidney couldn't bear the weight of his own imperfection. He chose duty over desire, symbol over self. Diane never fully forgave him for that choice, and Sidney never forgave himself for making it. Years later, in his memoir, he wrote with profound sadness, "I wonder sometimes what my life would have been if I had chosen differently, if I had put my own happiness first just once. But I was so afraid. afraid that one selfish choice would undo everything, afraid that my failure would be generalized to my entire race. And so I chose loneliness. I chose to be the symbol they needed instead of the man I wanted to be. Sidney also struggled with his relationship with Harry Belafonte, his closest friend and fellow trailblazer. The two men had been allies in the civil rights movement, had worked together, supported each other. But they had a falling out in the 1970s over tactics and philosophy. Sidney believed in working within the system. Belafonte believed in dismantling it. They didn't speak for 10 years. Sidney wrote letters to Harry, over 100 of them, but never sent them. "He is the brother I love and the man I fear disappointing," Sidney wrote in one unsent letter. The rift was eventually healed, but the pain of that separation stayed with Sidney. He had spent his life trying not to disappoint anyone, and in the process he had disappointed the people closest to him. Were these final decisions acts of surrender or courageous acts of self-preservation? By the 1980s and 1990s, Sidney had re-emerged, but in a different form. He directed films, wrote books, served as a diplomat for the Bahamas. He was elder statesman now, a living legend, revered but distant. Younger black actors like Denzel Washington, Will Smith, and Morgan Freeman acknowledged him as the man who had made their careers possible. But Sidney never fully embraced the role of icon. He remained humble, private, always deflecting praise. When asked about his legacy, he would say, "I just tried to do good work, that's all." But of course it was never that simple. His work wasn't just work. It was a statement, a battleground, a form of activism. And he knew it. In 2000, Sidney published his memoir, The Measure of a Man, a thoughtful, introspective book about his life and values. It was not a typical celebrity autobiography filled with gossip and glamour. Instead, it was a meditation on character, dignity, and responsibility. Sidney wrote about his father, his childhood, his struggles, his regrets. He wrote about what it meant to be a black man in America, what it meant to carry the hopes of millions. But even in the memoir, there was a distance, a reserve. Sidney revealed his thoughts but not his wounds. He gave readers the philosophy but not the pain. Perhaps that was all he could offer. Perhaps after a lifetime of being watched, the real Sidney Poitier had become inaccessible even to himself. On January 6, 2022, Sidney Poitier died at his home in Beverly Hills. He was 94 years old. The news spread quickly. Tributes poured in from around the world. President Biden called him a man of extraordinary talent and grace. Oprah Winfrey, who produced a documentary about him, said, "He showed us what was possible." Denzel Washington said, "Sidney opened the door that we all walked through, but he had to stand there and hold it open." The accolades were deserved, genuine, heartfelt. But they also reinforced the very thing Sidney had struggled with his entire life. He was being remembered as a symbol, not as a man. The funeral was private, small, attended only by family and close friends. There was no public memorial, no state ceremony, no grand spectacle. Sidney had requested simplicity. He didn't want his death to become a performance, but of course it did anyway. The world needed to mark his passing, to process what his life had meant. And so once again, Sidney Poitier became what he had always been, a mirror in which America saw its own struggles with race, dignity, and justice. In the days following his death, debates erupted. Was Sidney Poitier a hero or a compromise? Did he advance the cause of black equality or perpetuate a limited, palatable version of blackness? The arguments were passionate, intense, revealing. And Sidney, who had spent his life trying to transcend such debates, became the subject of them once more. What secrets did Sidney take to the grave? What hidden truths might still remain untold behind his public image? The truth is, Sidney Poitier's legacy is complicated, as all legacies are. He opened doors that had been locked. He proved that talent and dignity could overcome prejudice. He gave a generation of black children a hero who looked like them. But he also paid a price. The perfection demanded of him robbed him of his humanity. The symbol eclipsed the man, and the burden of representation, the knowledge that his success or failure would be generalized to an entire race, meant that he could never truly be free. There's a scene in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, one of Sidney's most famous films, where his character says to his father, "You think of me as a black man. I think of myself as a man." It's a line that encapsulates Sidney's entire philosophy. His desperate hope that one day race would be irrelevant, that people would be judged by their character rather than their skin color. But the tragic irony is that Sidney himself was never allowed that luxury. He was always seen as a black man first, an actor second, a human being third. His every achievement was racialized, every role politicized, every gesture interpreted as a statement about black people as a whole. But perhaps there's also something redemptive in Sidney's story. He carried an impossible burden with grace. He refused to be diminished even when the world tried to diminish him. He showed millions of people, black and white, that dignity is not something granted by society but something you claim for yourself. He proved that representation matters, that visibility matters, that seeing yourself reflected on screen can change how you see yourself in the world. And even though the cost was high, even though he sacrificed much of his personal happiness, the impact of his life cannot be denied. Sidney Poitier's story asks us to consider what we demand of our heroes. We want them to be flawless, to carry our hopes, to represent our best selves. But in doing so, we deny them their humanity. We turn them into symbols, and symbols cannot breathe. Sidney spent his life trying to be both, a man and a symbol, and the tension between those two identities slowly tore him apart. He once wrote, "Every time I walked onto a set, I carried my ancestors on my shoulders." But who was carrying him? Who was asking if the weight was too much? Who was giving him permission to be imperfect, to be angry, to be tired? In the end, Sidney Poitier did what he had always done. He endured. He outlived his critics, his doubters, and many of his peers. He saw the world change, slowly, imperfectly, but change nonetheless. He saw black actors win Oscars without it being headline news. He saw black stories told without apology. He saw, in some small way, the world he had fought for begin to emerge. But he also saw that the struggle was far from over, that the issues he had spent his life confronting, racism, inequality, representation, were still unresolved. And so, even in his final years, he could not rest. The burden never lifted, the expectations never ceased. The symbol outlived the man, but just barely. The house in Beverly Hills is quiet now, but the silence is no longer empty. It carries the weight of a man who turned dignity into a language the world finally learned to speak. The awards sit in a display case, gleaming reminders of a career that changed cinema. The books Sidney wrote line the shelves, filled with wisdom and reflection. But in the silence, one question remains, unanswered and unanswerable. Did anyone ever truly see him? Or did they only see what they needed him to be, a symbol, a breakthrough, a proof of concept that black people deserved equality? Who are you when the world demands you be perfect and never allows you to be yourself? Was Sidney Poitier truly free, or just perfectly caged by the world's need for him to be flawless? And when we demand perfection from those who carry our hopes, do we love them, or do we consume them? The stage is empty. The lights have dimmed, but somewhere in a theater, a young black actor watches in the heat of the night for the first time. They see Sidney Poitier stand tall, refuse to be diminished, demand respect in a world that denies it. And in that moment, the door Sidney held open remains open. The burden he carried is still being carried. And the question he could never answer, when will I be free to be just a man? echoes across generations, still waiting for a world honest enough to answer.